You know that classic, just completely cringe-inducing moment in a baseball game where a batter hits a pop fly right into shallow center field?
Oh, yeah. The absolute worst.
Right. If you've ever watched a game, you know the exact scenario I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The ball is just like hanging in the air,
Mm-hmm.
and you have the center fielder, the shortstop, and the second baseman, and they are all sprinting toward the exact same spot on the grass.
Just zeroing in on it.
Exactly. They all converge, they all look at each other, the whole crowd holds its breath, and then the ball just hits the grass.
Yeah, it's painful to watch.
It is. Because, I mean, you are looking at three professional athletes, right? Guys making millions of dollars, perfectly capable of catching a baseball.
Yeah, catching a pop fly is basic.
Super basic.
Yeah.
But they all just stand there staring at it on the ground because every single one of them assumed the other guy had it.
It's the ultimate breakdown of coordination, really, because think about it. They have the physical skill. They have the vision.
Right.
So the failure isn't about athletic ability at all. It's a failure of assigned ownership in that exact coordinate on the field. The space right between them just became this no man's land.
Wow, yeah. And today, we are taking that exact sports blooper and scaling it up to like the size of entire nations.
It gets much bigger than baseball.
So much bigger. We are taking a deep dive into a structural failure in governance, in our institutions, and honestly, in the very fabric of how our modern society operates.
Yeah.
The source material for this deep dive is this genuinely mind-bending essay by Elias Kunis called The Telos Gap.
It's a fantastic read.
It really is. And for you listening, our mission today is to figure out why massive, highly visible societal failures just keep happening right in front of our eyes. Why absolutely no one steps up to fix them, and, well, most importantly, the actual structural mechanism required to finally solve them.
Right. And to do that, we have to look past the usual excuses we all naturally fall back on when things go wrong.
Like,
Well, when we see a system failing, whether it's, say, a crumbling bridge in your town or a completely collapsing healthcare system, our first reflex is usually to point the finger at human incompetence.
oh, for sure. Or corruption.
Exactly, corruption or maybe just extreme bureaucratic complexity. We always assume someone is asleep at the wheel.
Because it's easier to think that, right?
It is. It's comforting. But we are going to set those comforting assumptions aside today. Instead, we are looking at the architecture of purpose itself.
Architecture of purpose. I like that.
Yeah, we are looking at why perfectly functioning systems inevitably create these massive systemic blind spots.
Okay, so before we figure out how to fix these ownerless failures, these pop flies that just hit the grass, we really have to define how institutions actually process the real world.
Right, because they don't see it the way you or I do.
Exactly. So Kunis defines this blind spot as a Telos Gap, and his definition is very specific. He calls it a real mechanism-produced harm that fails to enter any institution's admissible object intersection.
Which sounds like a mouthful.
It totally does. Let's translate that. So telos is an ancient Greek word for purpose, or like ultimate aim.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of a modern bureaucracy, a purpose isn't just a vague mission statement framed on a wall in the lobby. It is a highly rigid structure.
And that structure is the key to literally everything we are discussing today. To actually own a problem, to have a true institutional telos, Kunis argues that a government agency or an organization needs several very specific building blocks to intersect perfectly.
Okay.
If even one single block is missing, the entire purpose just evaporates.
So let's build one of these purpose structures. Let's make it concrete for you listening. Say we have a hypothetical problem, right? A highly polluted river flowing through a major city.
Okay, classic problem.
Right. For an agency to actually fix that river, what has to be in place? I assume the first thing is they actually need the authority to act.
Yes, exactly. A statutory mandate. The law has to specifically say, you are in charge of river water quality.
Like,
But a law is really just paper without a budget line. So that's the second element. The agency must have dedicated, protected funding to actually go clean the water.
got it. But even with money and a mandate, they need to know if they're succeeding, right? So they need a metric, like a measurable key performance indicator or KPI.
Yeah.
Let's say parts per million of toxins in the water.
Spot on. And to actually achieve that KPI, they need the fourth element, which is legal powers.
Well, like enforcement.
Exactly. They need the authority to physically enter those factories on the riverbank and shut down illegal dumping. If they have the mandate but literally zero enforcement power, the telos is broken.
Right. They'd just be standing there watching it happen. We also have human nature to account for, don't we?
We do.
So there has to be an internal incentive. The director of this agency needs to know that cleaning the river will lead to a promotion or, at least keep him from getting fired.
Mm-hmm. And that usually ties directly into the sixth element, which is a constituency.
A constituency, like voters.
Right. A group of people, maybe the local fishermen or angry residents downriver, who actually feel the gain or loss and actively apply pressure.
Which brings us to the seventh and final element, right? A procedural trigger.
Yes.
This is the mechanism that forces the issue onto a formal agenda. So it could be a mandatory quarterly review or an alarm that goes off when the toxicity hits a certain, danger level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have 7 elements: statutory mandate, budget line, measurable STI, legal powers, internal incentive, constituency, and procedural trigger.
That is a lot of boxes to check.
It is. And if a harm falls outside the intersection of those 7 specific things, it falls into the Telos Gap.
Wow.
And this leads to a really fascinating insight about how bureaucracies actually see the world. Institutions, fundamentally, do not respond to reality.
Right, really?
No, they only respond to reality after it has been translated into their admissible objects.
Admissible objects.
Sure.
Okay, let's unpack this because my instinct here, and I'm sure for you listening it might be the same, is to push back pretty hard on that.
Go for it.
If a government agency sees a real problem, even if it doesn't perfectly fit their rigid 7-point criteria and they just do nothing, isn't someone just dropping the ball? I mean, isn't this just a fancy way of describing human laziness?
See, it is incredibly tempting to blame laziness, because blaming a lazy bureaucrat implies that the problem is, at the very least, assigned to someone.
Right. It implies there's a guy in a chair who just needs a second cup of coffee.
Exactly. It implies someone is at the wheel who just needs to wake up. But Kunis argues the reality is much, much more unsettling than that.
Unsettling how?
Well, this is not about corrupt or lazy actors. In fact, well-functioning, highly efficient bureaucracies produce Telos gaps as a normal, natural product of their division of labor.
Wait, so the better they work, the more gaps they make?
Yes, because the gap is what falls exactly between their tightly defined jurisdictions.
So by blaming incompetence, we are assuming the failure actually belongs inside an existing actor's job description.
Precisely. The terrifying truth of the Telos Gap is that the actor whose job it is to fix the problem literally does not exist. The harm is entirely unowned.
That's wow. What's fascinating here is how this forces us to completely reevaluate the classic theories of why institutions fail.
It really does.
Because a lot of political science and, economics tries to explain why governments make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to differentiate the Telos Gap from those older theories so we aren't just putting a fresh coat of paint on an old idea.
A great point of comparison here is James C. Scott's famous concept of legibility.
Oh, right.
Scott argued that governments act like foresters who only plant trees in perfectly straight lines, basically because they can only manage what they can easily see and measure.
So if a forest is too wild and natural, the state is just blind to it.
Exactly. But Kunis clarifies that legibility is about perception, whereas a Telos Gap is about assignment.
Meaning the government might see the problem perfectly clearly, like the data is entirely legible.
Mm-hmm.
The reports are written, there's no blindness at all. But the problem still persists because perceiving it doesn't equal actually owning it.
Right. Then there is Goodhart's law, which you might have heard of.
The one about targets.
Yeah. It's the famous economic adage that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Because people just start gaming the system to make your numbers look good.
Okay. So if Goodhart's law says we game the car's dashboard to make it look like we are driving safely at Telos Gap, means the dashboard is actually completely honest and untampered with.
Mm-hmm.
The readings are 100% accurate.
Mm.
But the dashboard is just wired to the wrong part of the car.
No, that is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The dashboard is giving you completely accurate readings about, say, the engine temperature. But the wheels are actively falling off, and the system was simply never built to monitor the axles.
Wow.
The unmeasured, degraded parts of the car remain totally unowned even after the driver fully realizes the wheels are detaching.
That is terrifying. We should also probably touch on the idea of active suppression. In internet culture, people sometimes refer to systemic failure as Moloch, this idea of a shadowy, entrenched power structure actively resisting change.
Right, but a true Telos Gap does not require any powerful, shadowy actor trying to hide the truth.
So no conspiracy.
None. There are no smoke-filled rooms where billionaires are conspiring to keep a problem off the agenda. It is purely passive ownerlessness.
Passive ownerlessness.
Yeah, no one is fighting to suppress the issue. There just isn't a procedural agenda for the issue to land on in the first place.
Okay, let's move from the abstract theory into the real world. If these gaps exist, even when our dashboards are honest and there's no grand conspiracy, what does that actually look like for the normal people living inside the system?
Well, the essay provides specimens of what it calls the hidden adjustment gap.
Hidden adjustment gap.
Yeah. This happens when official targets are technically met, but the system secretly absorbs the cost of meeting those targets through unowned variables.
Okay, give me an example of that.
The first specimen Kunis examines is infrastructure maintenance debt, specifically the transport infrastructure backlog in Finland.
Okay.
And honestly, the dynamics here apply to almost any developed nation dealing with aging roads, railways, and bridges.
The details in the essay here are really striking. Because in Finland, the state doesn't hide its infrastructure decay at all.
No, it's very public.
The Transport Infrastructure Agency literally calculates and publishes the maintenance backlog every single year. Going into 2025, that backlog is around 4.18 billion euros.
A massive number.
It's huge. It is tracked.
Yeah.
The engineers know exactly which bridges are rusting and which roads are cracking, and occasionally a politician will throw a one-off bundle of cash at the problem.
Right.
So if the money is occasionally there and the knowledge is totally public, why is this a Telos Gap?
Because the system lacks a binding trajectory custodian.
A trajectory custodian. Let's break that down.
While the backlog is published, no single institution actually possesses a protected budget line, a dedicated KPI, and a procedural trigger focused solely on the curve of decay over time. When politicians allocate funding, it is almost always driven by the desire for new, highly visible projects. Ribbon cuttings for a brand new highway win elections.
Sure they do.
Invisible structural reinforcements on a 50-year-old overpass? Not so much.
But Kunis is saying this isn't merely a problem of selfish politicians just wanting photo ops, right?
Exactly. It goes way deeper than political motivation. Even if a remarkably selfless politician really wanted to prioritize maintenance, the structural architecture fights against them.
How so?
There is no entity whose rigid statutory duty is defending the maintenance trajectory itself, complete with a trigger that fires an automatic, undeniable alarm when the structural condition drops below a certain threshold.
So it's just partial objecthood.
We have the engineering knowledge, perfectly legible, but absolutely no binding ownership of the repair over time.
Which brings us to the second specimen, which takes this exact dynamic and applies it to human lives. He examines the care system, hidden adjustments, specifically looking at Finland's post-2023 well-being services system.
And this is perhaps the most visceral example of the hidden adjustment gap.
It's grim.
It is. In this healthcare system, individual performance indicators are documented constantly. You have agencies formally monitoring wait time breaches. You have strict audits of staffing shortages. You have reports on county financial deficits.
So everyone has their own little dashboard.
Right. And this isn't anecdotal. The Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare heavily audits this data. Comparative reports from the EU even show that in 2023, over 1 in 10 people in Finland and Latvia experienced unmet medical needs.
So again, the dashboard is completely transparent. Every separate institutional channel is doing its job perfectly. The agency monitoring wait times is publishing their report. The agency monitoring the budget is publishing theirs.
Exactly.
So if everyone is doing their job, where does the failure actually happen?
The failure happens because no one owns the joint vector.
The joint vector, meaning how all these separate, isolated metrics smash into each other out in the real world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see how institutions balance their books on the backs of unmeasured realities.
Give me a scenario.
Imagine a local hospital. They have a strict statutory mandate and a budget KPI that says they absolutely cannot run a deficit.
Okay.
And they meet that target perfectly. But how do they do it? They do it by informally rationing care, forcing patients to wait much longer, and requiring their nursing staff to work brutal overtime shifts until they just burn out and quit.
So the hospital's official budget dashboard flashes green. They succeeded.
Right.
But the actual cost of that success was absorbed by the nurse's mental health and the patient's prolonged suffering.
Yes, and neither the nurse's burnout rate nor the deferred suffering of the patients fits neatly into any single oversight agency's 7-point Telos intersection.
Wow. Those are the hidden adjustments.
Exactly. The system absorbs the underlying contradiction through variables that belong to absolutely no one. The official mechanisms report complete compliance, while the human reality just degrades in the unknown space between the agencies.
That honestly reframes so much of what we see in the news. We see these reports detailing systematic failures all the time, and the public outcry is always the same, like, we need to raise awareness. If people just knew how bad this was, the government would have to act.
Yeah, that is the illusion of knowledge.
The illusion of knowledge.
We assume that data naturally flows toward a solution. But Kunis references a concept from network architecture called optionality has no router.
Optionality has no router. What does that mean?
In network terms, this is a situation where a signal exists like a distress call, but the wiring in the switchboard is broken, so the call literally can't reach the operator.
But a Telos Gap isn't just a broken wire, is it?
No, it is far more severe. In a Telos Gap, the switchboard isn't just broken, there's no jack to plug the wire into at all.
Oh, wow.
There is no destination. No actor exists in the institutional architecture with the authority to receive the signal. You can build better routers. You can generate way more data. You can shout the warning from the rooftops, but there is no one on the other end whose actual job it is to answer the call.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because for you listening, think about how deeply ingrained the idea is that knowing is half the battle.
We hear it all the time.
We're taught from childhood that truth forces action. If you know the truth, you have to fix it. But Kunis demonstrates that in these structural gaps, knowledge is utterly inert. It does absolutely nothing.
Because we really have to look at how different societal groups metabolize that knowledge.
Right?
Let's say a brilliant, completely irrefutable expert report on a Telos Gap enters the public sphere. What actually happens to it?
The press picks it up.
Sure, the press gets hold of it, but journalism optimizes for conflict and narrative. If there is no clear villain to blame, just a structural gap, it is very hard to sustain headline coverage.
And then the political system looks at it.
Right, but politicians optimize for electoral salience.
Votes.
Exactly. If fixing an invisible, highly complex structural issue doesn't win votes in the next election cycle, it just drops off the priority list.
Finally, the bureaucracy looks at it. But bureaucracies optimize for procedural fit. If the crisis described in the report does not perfectly match their statutory mandate and their specific budget line, they physically cannot spend money or time acting on it.
So the knowledge doesn't get rejected or suppressed by some grand conspiracy. It just becomes residue.
Residue.
It becomes background metabolism. It's like the hum of a refrigerator. Everyone hears it, but nobody is assigned to fix it. So eventually we just tune it out completely. A warning can be mathematically proven and still just dissolve into the ether because knowledge without objecthood is totally useless.
Which brings us to the remedy. Because if raising awareness is useless, how do we actually force an institution to digest a failure? Kunis argues we need a brand new transmission mechanism.
Right.
We must restore what he calls objecthood under procedural constraint.
Yes.
Meaning, a public report by itself is way too rank. We have to create a new procedure that takes that knowledge and turns it into a heavy, unavoidable object that the system just cannot ignore. And he breaks this down into three vital procedural properties.
The first property is versioned publication.
Okay.
This means the documentation of the harm isn't just, a one-time PDF that gets thrown onto a dusty government website and forgotten forever. It is a living object with a date, a clear version history, a very clear status regarding who owns it, and a strict ticking review deadline.
So it's on a clock.
Exactly.
And that clock feeds into the second property, which is a right of reply with a deadline. It's where it gets some real teeth.
Indeed it does. Once this object is officially published, named institutions are formally notified. They literally do not have the option of ignoring it.
They can't just pretend it went to spam.
No. They have a bounded time period where they are legally required to do one of four things. They can formally accept ownership of the repair, they can dispute the claim entirely, they can point the finger and assign ownership to a different specific agency, or, and this is the most critical option, they can record their conscious non-action.
They have to formally admit, right on the public record, we see this massive failure, we completely agree it is happening, and we are actively choosing not to fix it.
Yes, and that ties directly into the third property, a visible audit trail. By forcing a formal response, the political system can no longer pretend the question never landed on their desk. The detailed record of exactly who responded and exactly how they justified their response becomes part of the living object itself.
That's brilliant.
The default option of silence is taken completely off the table.
Now, when I hear about a new authoritative body forcing institutions to respond to expert reports, my mind immediately goes to technocracy.
Understandably.
Yeah, it sounds like giving unelected experts the power to bypass democracy and just force elected officials to do whatever they want.
It is a crucial distinction to make, though. Kunis clarifies that this is absolutely not technocracy. The power being exercised by this new process is strictly procedural, not substantive.
Okay.
This mechanism does not give experts the power to actually choose the solution. It does not give them the power to allocate taxpayer funding.
So the elected actors still have to make the hard choices.
Yeah.
A mayor or a parliament still have to actually decide if they want to raise taxes to fix the bridge.
Exactly. It simply compresses the time between someone identifying a structural harm and the political system formally responding to it. It is the power to require that a question be answered, not the power to determine the answer itself.
I see.
The democratic process remains totally intact. It is just forced to be radically transparent about what it is neglecting. This raises an important question, though. Let's say a society actually builds a mechanism authority, a new institution whose sole job is to publish these objects and force these replies. What prevents that new institution from developing its own Telos Gap? What happens if the watchers themselves fail?
Oh, it's the classic who watches the watchman problem.
Yeah.
Because any new institution can fall victim to the exact same division of labor and blind spots we've been talking about this whole time.
Right. And Kunis is very transparent about this design risk. But he argues the risk is mitigated by how you evaluate this new authority.
Oh, so?
You do not evaluate them on substantive outcomes. You don't judge them on whether national poverty went down or if the roads actually got fixed. You evaluate them purely on procedural compliance.
Did they maintain the audit trail? Did they publish the objects before the deadline? Did they route the mandatory responses properly?
Yes, their own output sits inside the very same audit trail they are producing. The design doesn't magically eliminate the possibility of institutional failure, but it makes the class of failures much narrower, much more visible, and far more tractable.
You isolate the structural blindness so it can actually be managed.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize this deep dive and bring it right back to you, the listener. The next time you are at your job, or just looking at your local community or reading the news, and you see a glaring, massive failure that everyone acknowledges, but no one is fixing, stop yourself before you just complain about incompetence. And stop yourself from thinking that sharing a post or, quote-unquote, raising awareness is going to solve it.
Look past the narrative of the lazy bureaucrat and look for the missing telos.
Yes. Ask the structural questions.
Yeah.
Who actually holds the statutory mandate? Who holds the budget line? Who controls the procedural trigger? If those 7 elements don't intersect in one specific office, for one specific person, you haven't found corruption. You have found a Telos Gap.
Right.
The knowledge of the crisis exists, but the destination for that knowledge is just completely missing.
And that leaves us with a final, really lingering thought to mull over long after we wrap up here.
Let's hear it.
Kunis has shown us that modern governance naturally slices reality into tiny, perfectly defined jurisdictions, leaving the vast, complex spaces between them completely ownerless. If every well-functioning system inevitably creates these gaps as a byproduct of its own efficiency, what current massive global crisis that we all assume is just completely unsolvable or too complex to fix is actually just waiting for someone to force a right of reply with a deadline.